Hey, we're moving in, started last week to our next section of Matthew, and we spent months learning the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, and then we're moving into three sets of three miracles in chapters 8 and 9, and Jesus is showing us who he is, from the teaching of Jesus to the actual power of Jesus. So in Matthew chapter 8, I'm going to begin reading at verse 5. Remember last week I said that I thought the first week I was going to do 1 through 17, but only got through 4. I'm going to try to get through the rest. We'll see. Matthew chapter 8, beginning at 5. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. Jesus said to him, shall I come and heal him? The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve you to come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I tell this go, and he goes, and this one come, and he comes, and I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed and said to those following him, truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, let it be done just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took our infirmities, and he bore our diseases. This is the word of the Lord. Has anyone ever gotten really awesome treatment from a doctor? I have. Last year, y'all might remember this. Last year I was fishing. Well, I just got my fishing license at Walmart because that's where you go. And I got some worms and some different lures, and I had my rod, my tackle box, put it in the truck, and was at Evansburg State Park. 15 minutes into fishing, I stepped on some leaves, but there was about 3 or 4 inches of slick mud under it, and I fell so quick and landed on my right shoulder. I was still holding my tackle box and my rod in the hand, and I was looking up. Now, what I probably should have done was just gone straight to the emergency room because I couldn't move my arm and I couldn't lift my arm. But instead, I fished for about 30 minutes left-handed because what am I going to do? So I haven't got to fish since then. Did go to the emergency room because it turned all black. And when you're looking at your arm and you're telling it to go up and it's not, it was a little scary. What I found out later is that I had Dr. Chu, awesome doctor, he said, Pastor Tony, it looks like you ran, jumped in the air, and landed all of your weight in one spot, and you tore 3 of the rotators off completely and your bicep. It kind of hurts just thinking that, right? So I have the surgery, and you guys were praying for me then, and I had to wear this, I don't know, like 8 weeks. And you might not know, I don't want to be confined. And that's just funny, isn't it? Yeah, it's hilarious. So I had to wear this. And slowly but surely I started doing physical therapy. And I got in there and I really wanted to I was like, so what are we going to do? You know, am I going to bench press? He goes, listen, here's what you're going to do. So for the first week, I had to stand there and go like this. And then I was like, is there more than I can do than this? Like, I really want to get better. And she goes, yeah, go like this too. And I'm like, so weeks go by, yeah, and I didn't get to go to the gym, and I'm watching everybody else do stuff, and then they gave me like a little basketball, and I was like, oh, this will be good. What am I doing with this? And they're like, put it on the wall and just go like this. Now, weeks and weeks and weeks of physical therapy, and then I was able to really do stuff, and I remember saying to the physical therapist, okay, listen, I'm going to show you some pictures. I got to get back to this. So I want to get back to, I just got to muscle up. Remember that was like a goal. I just got to muscle up, and I really want to be able to do some handstand push-ups. So I'm showing a picture, and how am I going to get back to that? And the physical therapist, she looked at me and she goes, listen, none of us can do that. Our job is to get it so you can reach up to the top shelf and bring something down. That's our goal. So I did as much as they said, went back to Dr. Chu, and this is awesome news. He said, now your shoulder is better than it was even before you fell. And I was like, that is like amazing, right? So now I call this my good shoulder because we have come a long way in medicine. I mean, it is amazing the things that we can do now. And so I started to look up how far we've come. And one of the things that kind of struck me is, do you know in 1900 in the United States, almost 30% of children died before they were 5 years old? That just seems like I can't imagine that. And today, it's 0.5%. We've almost eliminated it. In the United States, same time period, the average age lifespan was 39 years old. Today, it's 79, and projected by the year 2050 to be 94. And not just age that much, but healthy. There's so much that's coming, and it is, if you just go and just start Googling that stuff and researching, because the same thing was going on, well, I'm going to get ahead of myself. In Palestine, most of the men, the lifespan at the time of Jesus was, for men, early 40s. Less than 10% made it to 60 years old. And for women, it was 32. Now, I don't think we can wrap our minds around all of the people we know, most of the time that you're in the age range of having children, at that time period, more than 40% aren't going to make it past a year. And then, on top of that, about the time you're done, you're probably going to die. It's just unbelievable. So, Jesus shows up on the scene, and he does something that is even more amazing than anything that we've seen progress in medicine in 2,000 years. So, at the end of Matthew chapter 4, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing, what's the word? Every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering in severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. And large crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. Then Jesus goes to the top of the mountain. He begins to teach. And it is amazing, the teaching. They were astonished. So he's teaching the disciples, the multitude of crowd behind him, and I know they're probably thinking, hey, stop for a minute, we still got some more people to heal. But he preaches the most amazing sermon that we took months and months to look at. And what is Matthew trying to get across here? Because we know that there were thousands and thousands of miracles done. Matthew is telling us his power is awesome. It's awesome. He cleanses a leper, heals a servant, raises up a woman, controls the sea, casts out demon, makes the blind see, makes crippled people walk, makes people that can't talk speak, heals every single sickness that's brought to him. This is an incredible display of power, and this is the next two chapters after the Sermon on the Mount. So what do we get? And I said this last week, but I'm going to tell it to you again because it's just so awesome. This is just one more in the category of Matthew proving that Jesus is the Messiah. And so how does Matthew do that? How does Matthew prove? Well, first in chapter 1, the genealogy. It's just showing that Jesus has the legal qualifications of the Messiah. He's the king. In the second chapter, it's his birth, the fulfillment of the number of prophecies that were attested to were in this chapter. He's the Messiah. Then the baptism of Jesus in chapter 3, the divine approval of his messiahship. This is my son. A voice from heaven comes out. And then in chapter 4, we come to the temptation of Jesus by the devil. This attested to his spiritual qualifications to be the Messiah. And then in 5, 6, and 7, the sermon. The Sermon on the Mount, he shows his theological qualifications. He's the Messiah. He doesn't say, and so this rabbi said, when he said it, he goes, you say, I say. You have heard it said, but I say. Authority. And now he comes to chapters 8 and 9. And we see miracle after miracle. And it proves he's the Messiah. He's God. Jesus is God. Listen, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is like, you've heard it say, but I say. And every single Jewish person that would have been sitting there would have had the question, who are you to say? To say. We know the law. The law says do not murder. You said do not murder. And then you said, but I say to you, don't even treat people dismissively. Don't say rakah. You said, our law says don't commit adultery. What did Jesus say? I'm explaining the law. I gave you the law. Yeah, as a matter of fact, we can just see the picture. Jesus on the top of the mountain. That should have been a little clue, right? Because Moses was on that. And who gave the law to Moses? God did. Jesus is saying, I gave you the law. Now I'm explaining it more to you. It's more than just don't commit adultery. I'm saying don't lust. It's more. It's more. You know, Jesus has the right. Why should we believe him? And he's going to show why we should believe him. So what does he do? In 2 chapters, Matthew's going to give us, and they're all different, 3 miracles, and then some teaching about discipleship, and then 3 miracles, some more teaching, and then 3 more miracles. Basically saying, I have all authority. Because who else can control everything? I came from heaven. That is his incarnation, chapters 1 and 2. I have authority. Jesus demonstrates that he has this supernatural power that there's no way. As a matter of fact, over and over again, he keeps telling the religious leaders, watch what I'm doing. Who can do this but God? Now, think about this. In Jesus' day, disease was, rampant. We have no idea because from biblical history, first century, all the way up into the 1500s, 1600s, 1800s, it basically was the same. You got sick, sickness just ran its course. There was hardly any intervention. And then you could go to that Google, what I just said about lifespan, and just go and then pick a year, and then just hover the mouse over different parts of the country, and it'll say something like lifespan, Australia, 1880, 39 years old. Just over and over again. And then you could just move the needle along the bottom of the graph, and the lifespan all around the world has been going up. Now, what was going on at the time of Jesus? There was a tremendous fear of disease. There was so much pain and suffering that couldn't be alleviated. There were plagues that just wiped out entire cities and countries. It was greatly feared. There were incurable diseases that we just almost can't explain. Most people died very young. And like I said, lifespan at the time of Jesus for men was the early 40s, and for women, early 30s. And the Bible talks a lot about the time of Christ and diseases that were going on, and in the Old Testament. Let me give you a couple, because there was all kind of categories that these might fall under. The Bible talks about atrophy, which would encompass diseases like muscular dystrophy. It talks about blindness, and I had no idea how rampant blindness was, but it was very common that when a child was born, passing through the mother would be infected and would be blind. There was blindness because of just unsanitary conditions. There was blindness because of how the heat, blowing sand. There was blindness because of war and injuries. And and I was reading this, there were people that had these boils. They were inflected glands. There was a lot of deafness. Same kind of reason because of birth defects, how they were born, or injury. And because of infections in their middle or inner ear that would do it. There was dysentery because of bacteria and worms. There was lots of colon diseases in the digestive tract. There was epilepsy. There was hemorrhaging. There's a lot of bleeding problems the Bible talks about, which could include stuff like fibroid tumors and things like that. And it talks a lot about inflammation, probably referring to, most of the commentators said, like staph or strep infections. Pestilence was big because any like rodents, like rats, would carry diseases. The one we talked about last week, leprosy, which was so feared by so many people because it put you out. It wasn't just a disease you just died from. It made you separate yourself from all the other people, so you were very lonely. The Bible talks about tumors. It talks in leprosy, paralysis, and then even fever. And not like fever like we get a fever, we take some Tylenol, we wait it out, like fever and it's probably going to kill you fever. Can you imagine that's always hanging over your head? And then Jesus comes along in Sermon on the Mount and he goes, I say, do not worry. Well, there's a lot of stuff that seems to be worried about. But along comes Jesus, and he literally, for this period of time, this little area in Palestine, he wipes out disease. So this little group of people, and I can't imagine what other people, that's why people were coming from far away. This little section is disease-free, at least for a period of time. But Jesus is doing something more than just alleviating suffering. I think it's hard for us to understand. We either have gotten sick, know someone's gotten sick, seen things, but for the most part, we live in a society that can kind of handle disease. And even if something like cancer or heart disease gets us, there's even ways that we can alleviate pain. In this society, there was no such thing. So Jesus is stepping onto the scene, and he's preaching about the kingdom of God, but he's also touching people. And that's why we said last time, how could anyone deny what Jesus was doing? When we get to Matthew chapter 12, but when Jesus knew it, he withdrew himself from there, took away from the Pharisees, and a great multitude started to follow him, and he healed them all. And then in Matthew 14, the same thing. And Jesus went forth, saw a great multitude, was moved to compassion toward them, and healed their sick. He healed them all. He healed all who came. The Bible tells us Jesus came, and he healed them. He was banishing disease. So how did Jesus heal? This is like so awesome, because I want you to think about the healing I went through. I mean, it was a long process. And I'm glad that I'm on the other end of that now. But when Jesus healed, Jesus did it with a word or a touch. When Jesus healed, it was instantaneous. Think about that. Everyone, it says, and immediately, and at that hour, and immediately, over and over again. Just read through those passages. When Jesus healed, he healed. When Jesus healed, it was total. There was no PT after. There's no physical therapy. If Jesus would have touched my shoulder, it would have been like, I am super strong now. Like, it was like healed. It wasn't, isn't this so cool? I said this last week. When Jesus, here's a guy, he's never walked. Not only did Jesus heal him and forgive him, but he did something where the guy knew how to walk. Do you remember when you're teaching your kids how to walk? No? You don't remember that? I thought it was funny. I'm like, let him go. But when Jesus did it, immediate and it was total. And it was like they had always been walking. It wasn't like he had to build up his muscles. They were all there. And he healed everybody. It says every. So he came across it. People brought to him. He just healed everyone. And, this is awesome, it was undeniable. Nobody could deny it. Like, everybody knew, that's the guy that's been sitting at the gate for as long as I can remember. He's always been blind. Like, when Jesus healed, it was obvious. It wasn't like, well, I have this low back pain and a person lays hands on you and then eventually over time. No, it was undeniable. And Jesus even raised the dead. And that's why eventually they're going to want to kill him. Instead of believe him by the miracles that he did, when Lazarus gets raised, they get together. Here's the religious leaders. You know what we got to do? We got to kill Lazarus. What did Lazarus do? And we got to kill Jesus because they're messing up our system. Instead of falling down like the man with leprosy and like this centurion and just worshiping him for who he is. Because there was no other explanation for what Jesus was doing except the divine explanation. And that's why the religious leaders, the Pharisees, that's why their unbelief is so unbelievable. People would not believe in the face of such incredible evidence. And Matthew indicts them in this section. And in thousands and thousands of miracles, Matthew, for this section, points out 3. And most of the commentators say this was all in one day. And it was started with the man with leprosy. He touched the man with leprosy. Remember, the leper had to walk around saying, mumbling, unclean, unclean, and keeping his face covered, and keeping his clothes torn on purpose, and staying away from everybody. But what did we learn last week? Quick review. So I haven't gotten to point 1 yet. 4 things about last week, right? He came with confidence. He was bold. The leper was bold. Josephus said, the first century historian says that lepers were treated like dead people. People didn't, just got away from them. They were like dead. And he may have been dead in everybody else's eyes, but he had a need and he knew Jesus could meet it, and he just walked up. And the crowd probably just went, whoo, away. And he asked Jesus. And he came. And he shows reverence, right? Not only does he come boldly, he comes worshiping. We can't say much about his body, but we can see a lot about his soul, because here he was in those rags with his face covered, and he falls before Jesus, and he's exalting, and he calls him Lord. And he's humble, and he says this, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Is that amazing? He doesn't say, will you heal me? He just acknowledges the fact, humbly, that you can do it if you want to. I know you're sovereign enough, but I'm worshiping you anyway, either way. And this is important. This is important. Because sometimes we pray, and we pray for healing, but I think in that we need to trust, Lord, I know you can do it. I'm not doubting that. But I'm worshiping you whether you do or you don't. I'm trusting you whether you do or you don't, because when Paul prayed, heal me, the Lord said, no. And there was a reason. He said, my grace is sufficient for you. I want you to trust me even in the suffering. Paul knew he could do it. In the case of the leper, Jesus did do it. And he came and listened. Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. He had faith. Lord, you are willing. You have the dunamis. You have the power. You have the power if you are able. I know you can. I don't know if you will, but I'm trusting you either way. And Jesus touches the man and the crowd. Because that would have made Jesus unclean. But it doesn't make Jesus unclean. It makes the leper whole. And I said this last week. He probably needed the touch. Jesus didn't need to touch him. Jesus could have said it and he would have been healed. Jesus could have said it while he was still walking. Jesus would have known his heart, known it. He could have said, dude, you're healed. Just keep going. We don't need to mess up my crowd here. But he doesn't. He lets them see it. Now, in verse 5, when Jesus has entered Capernaum, A centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, my servant lies at home paralyzed and suffering terribly. Now, the Jews would have considered the leper like, don't touch a dead body, don't touch a person with leprosy. And then, what does Matthew give us? Matthew gives us a centurion. What are the religious leaders thinking now? They're all following him. A centurion? He's a Gentile. And worse than a Gentile, he's a Roman soldier. He's part of the occupying force. So you think we hated the leper, we really hate this guy. And we're going to see that God's got a plan. And Jesus is showing us this. I'll tell you in a minute. So he finished the sermon, he comes down, he heals the leper, he goes into Capernaum. And Luke chapter 7 gives some insight to the same passage, so you could read both of them together. And it's kind of amazing because it seems like, man, this guy's got some faith in Jesus. And he seems like a good guy. As a matter of fact, just search the word centurion, and for some reason, each time the Bible talks about the centurion, they end up being like a guy that like is going to trust Jesus, or it's seeming like a good guy. Like, it's pretty amazing. So every time you see centurion, you'll see it Cornelius, you'll see it at the crucifixion. It seems like, wow, these guys are wanting to trust Jesus. And it's sort of like a slap in the face of the kind of exclusive that the religious leaders were being. It wasn't bad enough to be a Gentile. It wasn't bad enough that he's a Roman soldier. Do you know what one other thing? I didn't know this as I was studying this week. The Roman soldiers just didn't bring their soldiers from Rome. When they occupied a force, they actually got their army from that area. And so what they did in Palestine was found non-Jewish people in the area and trained them into the Roman army. So this man in Capernaum was a soldier under the troops of Antipas. And if he was a Samaritan. And do you know what makes a Samaritan even worse? Because that means a Samaritan was one of your parents was Jewish and married a Gentile, thereby defiling themselves and defiling their offspring. And so here is a Gentile, a Roman soldier that's the occupying force, and worse yet, a Samaritan. And then Jesus is going to even talk to him. Now, here's what's kind of unique, and Luke chapter 7 tells us that the religious leaders in that town came to Jesus too and said, you should do this favor for this centurion. It's like, why are they on this guy's side? This would have been everything. And, you know, they said that he should be done the favor, and there's a reason for it, because Lord, I think he basically paid for the synagogue. So what is they knew Jesus could heal. They weren't going to trust Jesus as the Messiah, but since this guy's been helping them out, you could do this favor for him. So we're not going to trust in you as the God who can heal, but you should do this guy a favor. So it seems like a money thing. But what do we learn? He comes, the centurion, Lord. And I think it's here using the divine sense like the leper was. He understands the power that Jesus has, and he understands where that must be coming from. As a matter of fact, it says servant, but this is really a child slave. This is a child slave. So you take Luke and read it and read along with this. And this is a child slave, and he's homesick, and it's called paralykokos, which means he's paralytic, and he's suffering. So he's homesick with some kind of paralysis, and he's suffering. Some people said it either could be like polio or some kind of nervous system disorder, and we don't exactly know what, but it was causing him a lot of pain. Now, I kind of like the centurion because you're reading about it, and he cared about this servant, this slave that lived in the house. In fact, in the Roman Empire, slaves at this point did not matter. If they lived, it didn't matter. If they suffered, it didn't matter. If they died, it didn't matter. They were kind of no consequence. As a matter of fact, I was reading Aristotle this week, and he said, there can be no friendship and no justice towards inanimate things. Indeed, not even toward a horse or an ox or a slave. For a master and a slave have nothing in common. A slave is a living tool. I was like, that's brutal, but that's kind of how they were looked at. They had no rights. Gaius, the Roman law expert, he said, we may note that it is universally accepted that the master possesses the power of life and death over his slave. That was Roman law. You don't like your slave, you kill him. The Roman writer wrote on agriculture, the only difference between a slave and a beast and a cart is that the slave can talk. So it's kind of interesting that this Roman centurion has enough faith to realize who Jesus is, seems to be a God-fearing Gentile because he gives money to help them build a synagogue, and then he comes to Jesus. His servant is home, lying sick, paralyzed, and tormented. He loves our nation. He built a synagogue. So he's God-fearing. He loves the nation. He built them a synagogue. And scholars say that the footing for that synagogue is still in Capernaum today. I was like amazed by that. Like you could go and see, here's where this guy's money was, and it's still there. That doesn't mean anything. I just thought that was interesting. Sometimes I throw things in that are just interesting pieces of information. The religious leaders knew that Jesus could heal. Everybody knew that he could heal. There wasn't any debate about it. But their hearts were so hard that they wanted this favor done, but they weren't going to worship Jesus. But he does. So he's humble. He's gentle. He loves this slave. As a matter of fact, in verse 6, he says to him, Lord. And then in the middle of verse 10, Jesus says, I've found no faith so great. This is the greatest faith I've ever seen. Faith in the reality of who Jesus was and what it was meant. I believe he believed that Jesus was who he says he was. He's affirming the lordship of Christ. And what a rebuke to the Jews. For first a leper, and then this Samaritan Gentile soldier. And Jesus says, this is the greatest faith I've ever seen. How do you think those Pharisees were feeling at that moment? That's the greatest faith you've ever seen? Look at my long tassels. And my beard trimmed exactly. He's grievously tormented. And he's paralyzed. But he doesn't request anything either. He just gives the information. The centurion just gives the information. What did we see? The leper says, I know that you can do it. And he's just giving the information. He doesn't say, will you do it? He just tells Jesus, this is the situation. His prayer is just kind of a prayer of information. Lord, here is the need. I lay it before you. But you're sovereign. And then Jesus says to him, I'll come and heal him. The centurion panics. He panics. And Jesus said unto him, I'll come and I'll heal him. The centurion doesn't feel worthy. And Lord, I'm not worthy that you should come under my roof. Do you know what he understood? He understood that for a Jew to enter the house of a Gentile would be to make them unclean, would be to violate their law. And he didn't want Jesus to do that. No, don't violate your law to help me. And then see his faith. Then his faith is amazing. He says this, I'm not worthy of that. You don't have to enter my house. You don't have to do that. Here's a drill sergeant, basically, over 100 people, combat, but he's humble and sensitive, and he cares about this slave, but he's wanting to make sure that Jesus, he said, speak the word only, and my servant will be healed. Just speak the word. He said, I see something. I know your power. You can just say it, and he'll be healed. In verse 9, For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me. I say to this one, go, go, and he goes, come, and he comes, do this, and he does it. He says, I know what authority is, and I know what kind of authority you have. I mean, that's some authority, right? To believe that, hey, I know your authority, you can just say it, and it'll happen. I've seen what you've done. I know the power of your words. I mean, this is like amazing faith. When Jesus heard this, he marveled. It actually is like Jesus is surprised. You know, by the way, after this, there's going to be a lot of Gentiles that trust and believe Jesus. As a matter of fact, most of the church today is Gentile people. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. And he could have just stopped there, but he didn't. The religious leaders were around him. So he continued. No, not in Israel. I've never seen this kind of faith among any of you. And you're the people of the promise. You're the people that have the law. You're the people who God spoke to and made a covenant with. And you don't even have faith like this Samaritan Gentile Roman soldier. I've never seen such great faith. And what does Jesus even say about his own disciples? Oh, ye of little faith. He even has more faith than the disciples do, at least at this moment. As a matter of fact, Philip says, show us God. And he says, Philip, how long do I have to be with you? But this has, I think it's also kind of a foretaste of the kingdom to come. That there are going to be lots of Gentile people, billions and billions of Gentile followers of Jesus. And the religious leaders of this day didn't think. As a matter of fact, here's what they thought. They thought the Messiah was going to come, set up his kingdom, and wipe out all the Gentiles. And here's Jesus coming along, and in doing a miracle, heals some Gentiles. As a matter of fact, what does he say? I say to you, many shall come from the east and the west, and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Do you know what that is? That's us. He's saying many are going to come from the east and the west, and they're going to be in the kingdom. He's telling those religious leaders that are there, oh, the kingdom's way bigger than you're thinking. What was their little saying? They had this little saying that I thought was hilarious. I got to find it. Us four no more, shut the door. That wasn't their saying, but do you know what it is? They thought it's just us. We're the only kingdom people. And just like, no. The gospel came through Abraham's seed. Salvation, we are blessed. As a matter of fact, for Abraham, I will make, right? The sands of the sea, the stars of the sky. I'm going to bless all peoples through you. Not just one little group. Many shall come from the east and west and sit down with them. Who are the many? We are the many. I think the main point is the east and the west is encompassed the whole Gentile world. So Jesus heals a leper, and then he heals a centurion's slave. And then next, this is funny, next is a woman. And not only just a woman, it's a mother-in-law. But you see what Jesus is doing? I'm sure there was got to be some Pharisees that were sick or something, but Matthew's telling us, he is just blowing the face off of everything that they thought. A leper, a Gentile, a woman, and what's going on? What is Jesus doing? I think we underestimate what he's really doing. I mean, think about it. He's feeding hungry, healing sick, blind, deaf, liberating oppressed, raising the dead, going everywhere and doing good, dealing with this human suffering. And I said this last week, and I think this is huge. He's doing more than just that healing there. He's pointing to the kingdom. Here's what he's doing. When Jesus is calming a storm or healing a disease, making a blind person see, making a mute person be able to talk, somebody who's dead raised to life. He's pointing back and saying, this isn't how it created the world. This is wrong. This is the thing that's not natural. Death is not natural. Disease is not natural. Those are because of sin. How I created the world was perfect. And he's pointing back. And he's pointing forward. That's what it's going to be. Because I'm going to come back. There's a kingdom coming. Do you see? He's pointing back and he's pointing ahead. He's doing those miracles, and I think he's helping those people, but all those people are eventually going to what? They're all going to die. And he's doing something. He's pointing back to a world when there was no suffering and no disease and no death. When he takes that storm and he stops it by his word. And it wasn't like stop and then it slowly kind of, no, it just stopped. And what were the disciples when that happened? They were scared to death. Who can do this? Because tsunamis and earthquakes and avalanches and blizzards and stupid Yankee weather, that wasn't part of God's kingdom. Just had to throw that in. People, I like the change of the seasons. Yeah, you must not have to dig a lot. But that wasn't the primary thing, right? Death, decay, and suffering. Jesus is just for a moment, at least temporarily, one theologian said Jesus' healings are the only natural thing. The only natural thing in a world that is unnatural, demonic, and wounded. And when Jesus comes back, the Bible tells us there'll be a feast, and there'll be no more sickness, and no more decay, and no more crime, and no more war, and no more suffering, no more death, and not even a tear. So what is Jesus showing us in this? I want you to think about it for a minute, because he's alleviating suffering. But think back to a few chapters before. And chapter 4 of Matthew, Satan is tempting Jesus. And he says, just snap your fingers and turn these stones into bread. He says, just throw yourself off the cliff. And what's he doing? Well, Satan tempting him. I want you to be like Superman. He's trying to get him to use his power just as a display of power. And Jesus was not about that. Jesus' supernatural power doesn't work like that. This amazing miracle of the incarnation in which the Son of God actually becomes vulnerable, a baby. You know, when Jesus does a miracle, everyone that he does, the enemies of him get angrier and angrier and angrier. Till they start saying stuff like, we're not going to eat until we kill him. His supernatural power makes him more vulnerable, more spearable, more nailable, more killable. Everything he does. And the very last verse, how does Jesus deal with our brokenness? He bears it. Because if Jesus Christ had actually come to earth ready to judge all evil, we're all done. We would have all been done. We would have never even made it to us today because everybody then would have been done. If Jesus Christ just came to bring judgment, we'd be gone, but he came to bear the judgment. He bore it. And not just the disease, but the brokenness, death itself. All the curse of people turning away from God, Jesus, the weakness, the suffering, the death, he bore the judgment. And someday he'll come back and make the world perfect again. And that time, he will end all evil without having to end us. Do you see what he did? Because of his death on the cross, he paid. And because of his resurrection, there's power. And when he comes back, we are not going to have to do it because he paid. And so, I'll say it again. He bore the judgment so someday he can come back and make the world perfect and end all evil without ending us. This shows the power. And so, how do we respond? We need to respond exactly like the leper and just fall down and worship him. We need to respond like the centurion and say humbly, no, all you have to do is just say the word. We need to respond like Peter's mother-in-law. Do you know what happened? Right when he healed her, the fever was gone, and she got up and she served him. That's us. How are we going to do this? How are we going to do what Jesus wants us to do? I think we need to realize this great power that he became weak for us. And we need a Lord and Master that cares about us that much. Bow your heads. Lord, we come. And we are thankful for the amazing progress that you've allowed or given us as human beings to alleviate suffering, to cure many diseases. But we know that the greatest of these is not just so that our lifespan can be a few more years on this earth, Lord, but you came that we would have eternal life. Eternal life. And you weren't just showing your power, you were actually telling a story. And you were showing us how you created it and how you are going to recreate it. And Father, I want all of us to be part of that. And so I asked if any of us are blind, that we would be able to see who Jesus really is. And Lord, if any of us have never spoken, that you would open our tongues, that we would confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. We pray this to bring glory and honor to you. Amen.